Alright folks, how's it going? It is time to get started here. I'm going to kind of be putting a few things up onto the screen while we are getting going. So I can do this a couple ways, right? I can kind of go through the class website that we are all familiar with, or I might as well just kind of open up the PowerPoint slides that I gave you guys. There is already a video of me going over this for about 48 minutes here that you can undoubtedly listen to get a little bit more in depth maybe, or just go a little bit slower. I'm going to kind of really drive this fairly quickly here, just for sake of time, for your guys' time and my time here as well. We'll run through most of the material. I'll answer any questions you guys have, and we will go from there. So hopefully you can hear me. Can someone just let me know that you can hear me in the chat, and then we'll get started here. My cat has joined the party, as you guys can see. Can none of you... No one's responding, so I have no idea if you can hear me or not. I'm gonna unmute myself just to listen for a second. You can hear me? Okay. I don't need to do that then. So, okay, let's kind of get rolling here. So we are talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction, right? So all of these things are just kind of the wording of the way the state decides what they want us to teach you guys. So you can really read through these on your own, but these are things that you're supposed to kind of understand when we're all done here. But let's get to the meat of the things, right? So we talked about the causes of the Civil War, right? The causes of the Civil War are a number of different things, right? As far as a quick run up here, we talked about the Missouri Compromise, right? This line that gets drawn to decide when Missouri and Maine are going to come into the Union, whether they're going to come in as slave states and free states, and the compromise being this line that anything north of the line would come in as a free state going forward, anything below would come in as a slave state, right? So this is going to set things up and set up tensions later down the line when this isn't necessarily followed. You're going to have the tariffs of 1928. I said 1928. Oof, I need to change that. It's 1828 and 1832. And then the whole nullification crisis. We talked about that with Andrew Jackson. And this is going to be important because, again, further lead to tensions. The South is going to... Some of them are going to argue that they want to actually secede around this time because of the tariffs that they feel were illegal to them. The tariff of abominations, if you remember the words, because they decided they were going to make goods coming in from Europe a bit more expensive for them, which increased the prices of the goods for them in the South, and they got angry. So you also get Nat Turner's slave rebellion causing tension as well. We have the Compromise of 1850 when California is going to come in into the Union, and then you're going to get this whole idea of popular sovereignty for the new territories we gained from Mexico, and then also in the Kansas and Nebraska territory not long after with the Kansas and Nebraska Act, right? This leads to violence there for them trying to decide, and all of these things mixed together with some ineffective presidential leadership in the 1850s is going to lead to a civil war, right? So there's some other things, too, we talked about. We talked about the whole rise of the abolition movement. Sorry, I'm trying to grab my cat here while I'm talking. Ugh. Although he doesn't want to be picked up, apparently. Yeah, I need to put him down. Anyway, you have the Northern abolitionists and the whole rise of the abolitionist movement, and you have Southerners that are defending slavery, right? So as far as abolitionists go, you're going to have this man named William Lloyd Garrison, who's going to publish what's called The Liberator, which is an abolitionist newspaper. My cat is just getting in the way. I might have to put him out of the room here momentarily. But anyway, so you have William Lloyd Garrison in his publication, The Liberator. You have Frederick Douglass and his publication, The North Star, which are all abolitionist newspapers. You're going to get the publication of the book Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which is going to depict the harsh realities of the slave life to a large audience that wasn't necessarily familiar with it, especially those in the North who hadn't seen it. And you're going to have Abraham Lincoln joking with her a bit later, after the Civil War had started, saying, so this is the little old lady who started this great big war, right? So moving forward here, we talked about the Dred Scott decision, which is this is a United States Supreme Court decision, basically saying that slaves are property, and effectively, because of that, they can't sue in federal court, and therefore he can't get what he wants, to be free. And then also goes further, saying that the government has no power to regulate slavery in the territories acquired after the creation of the United States. And as a result, this is one of the craziest Supreme Court decisions. And basically, it causes a whole lot of tension when it comes out and says that if there's no free states, or no such thing as free states, then basically you can have slaves anywhere, right? And that's not something that the North likes to hear, right? So you also have now the election of Abraham Lincoln, right? And the election of Abraham Lincoln is another big piece of this puzzle, and it's the kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. And you are going to have an election where not one southern state votes for Lincoln, but he's still going to become the president, right? And that's a pretty big deal. So after all of the tension and all the buildup that we've been talking about and saw, you're going to get the first wave of secession in February 1861 following the election. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Then you're going to get these states are saying specifically they're identifying the threats to slaveholders' rights as their major cause of secession. It's in the declarations of secession, essentially. And they're going to form the Confederate States of America. And you can see the flags down here and the election results, right? So we get the Battle of Fort Sumter, right? And the Battle of Fort Sumter is an attack by the South on a Union fort in Charleston, South Carolina, right? The South shoots first here. And they bombard the Union fort. There is going to be return gunfire, obviously, because they're under attack. And this is going to be the opening confrontation of the Civil War. Immediately following this, you are going to see Abraham Lincoln immediately call for federal troops, right? He's going to call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress this insurrection, this rebellion. And you're going to ultimately get the last four of these Confederate states to secede: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Right? So we talked about the leaders. We obviously know Abraham Lincoln. He's going to win the presidential election of 1860, and his election is going to spark off that wave of secession. We know this, right? And Lincoln's big thing is that he is insistent to keep the Union together but with force if necessary, right? He believes in this perpetual Union, and effectively is willing to do stuff to not let it stop, right? You have Jefferson Davis is the Confederate president, right? Of the Confederate States of America. He is going to be chosen as president of them, and he's going to remain president of the Confederacy until the end of the Civil War, right? So you should be able to recognize a picture of him, because I know that in previous SOLs, you actually have had pictures of him and asking him to match him up. So knowing what these people look like are probably a good idea. So you also have Robert E. Lee, right? And Robert E. Lee is chosen as the Confederate general of the Army of Northern Virginia, which is really just the name for the largest. Sorry, my cat's trying to get out by the door over here, so I'm going to let him out. But anyway, so he is chosen as the Confederate general, and Lee is actually opposed to secession early on here, but he didn't really believe the Union should be held together by force, and he's going to end up siding with Virginia. He sees himself as a Virginian first, so when Virginia secedes, he feels like he's going to do his duty to his state, and he joins the Confederacy himself, right? So we know the opening battle is Fort Sumter. We've kind of already talked about that. Here's just another kind of drawing of that, if you will. So this is a map, more or less, of the Eastern Theater in the Civil War, right? And the fighting in the East is going to more or less take place specifically within roughly 100 miles radius or so, if not just even a little less than that, of Washington, D.C., right? It's in this kind of 100-mile corridor here between Richmond down here and Washington, D.C. up here, where most of these battles are going to take place in the East. And we started talking about the first Battle of Bull Run, or in other words known as First Manassas, right? It's a major shock to the North when the Grand Army of the Potomac is romped basically by the Confederates. We looked at all the advantages the North had in population and industry and all of those things, right? So it really comes as a major shock when the Confederacy pushes the North and forces them to retreat in this first major confrontation anyway. And that's a bit of a big deal, right? So George McClellan, this man who is going to eventually run for president against Abraham Lincoln in 1864, he assumes command of the Union Army, but he is ultimately reluctant to commit to these advantages we talked about against the Confederacy. And the war is going to kind of stall out for almost a year here. There will be skirmishes and fights and things like that go on, but ultimately, as far as large battles go, we're not going to see too many of them until Antietam, over a year later. And you're going to have Robert E. Lee, who had some success in the South at this point, and he's going to kind of move his way up toward Antietam and launch this invasion of the North. They're going to be repelled by the Union at this point, which is still the single bloodiest day in American history, right? We have over 3,600 dead, 22,000 plus casualties. It is still the single bloodiest day, right? Even over 9/11 and D-Day in World War II. And Lincoln is not particularly happy with McClellan for a number of reasons. Basically that McClellan had been taking his sweet time and being very reluctant, and Lincoln's going to replace McClellan with a man named Burnside, which I'm not going to expect you to know, after this dissatisfaction and after the Battle of Antietam. McClellan is going to be very bitter about it, and which is one of the reasons why he's going to end up running for president against Lincoln in 1864, but we'll get to that, right? So, with the success, if you will, of the repelling the invasion at Antietam, you're going to have the issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and the Emancipation Proclamation is a really important thing, even though it doesn't necessarily do what everyone thinks it does, right? So the Emancipation Proclamation, first and foremost, does not free all of the slaves, right? That's one of the biggest misconceptions about the document in the first place, right? Prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, the North's main goal was to actually preserve the Union, but when this is issued, it's going to essentially make abolition of slavery an objective of the war, right? And this is something that Lincoln couldn't have stated early on, right? And he had been hesitant to basically act on this because of the border states, these states that did not secede from the Union. You have Kentucky, Maryland, right? Some of these states that were slave states that effectively hadn't left the Union, right? So if all of a sudden they were to flip because they supported, the war became about slavery, that would be a problem, right? He also felt that by making it about slavery, the popularity of the war would extremely dwindle, right? So that's one of the reasons why he waits so long to do this. So, first and foremost, the Emancipation Proclamation is a wartime measure, right? It's going to free slaves, but it's going to free slaves in the South, right? It's going to free slaves in areas of open rebellion, which means, again, it does not free any slaves, essentially, at least initially here, because when it comes down to it, what authority does Abraham Lincoln have over the Confederate States of America at this point, right? It's going to weaken it because you're going to have all the slaves in the South hearing this, and they're going to want to kind of do what they can to maybe support them or run away to join the Union Army and things like that. But ultimately, it doesn't free any slaves in the border states or any areas of the Union, right? Yeah, and it will allow for the enlistment of African American soldiers in the Union Army, which does start to benefit the Union Army based off of numbers. And you're also going to now have, when the Union pushes into the South anywhere, they will be able to effectively take control of some of those areas, and then that's when freeing those slaves make a difference, right? Because then they can be put into the army, which is what you saw in the movie Glory, and effectively they can be used to fight against the Confederacy, right? So We also talk about Frederick Douglass, right, who is a former enslaved African American who's going to become a prominent abolitionist. He's going to have his own newspaper, right, the North Star, and he's going to be the one that's going to be urging Abraham Lincoln to recruit former African Americans to fight in the Union Army, which is again going to become a major advantage for them as far as numbers, because the Confederacy is not going to want to allow armed slaves, right, because that would just, if they could just turn on them, and that would not work for them, right? So after you're going to have some momentum now in 1863, so after Antietam and after the Emancipation Proclamation, early in this fighting season, as the weather warms up and things, Robert E. Lee's going to get some momentum, right? And he's going to be able to push north, and this time he's going to push all the way up into Pennsylvania, which is truly in Union territory at this point, right? So you're going to have this 3-day battle that erupts at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and this is going to be the deadliest engagement of the war. So I'm trying to not confuse you here. You know, Antietam is, yes, it's the single bloodiest day in American history, but Gettysburg, with the 3-day battle total, is going to be the deadliest of the whole war, right? So you're going to have 57,000 casualties from both sides, which is a pretty incredible number if you think about it, right? And the Union is going to be successful in repelling the Confederate Army at Gettysburg, partially as a result of what's called Pickett's Charge, which we didn't necessarily talk about too much. But the Pickett's Charge in Gettysburg is going to be kind of this big downward moment for the Confederacy, with this failure that arguably could have potentially lost them the war. So anyway, you have the Gettysburg Address, which you all, most of you anyway, read for me. That's going to be delivered by Abraham Lincoln not that long after this is all said and done, right, after Gettysburg. He's going to restate, essentially, that the Union is not going to back down here, that backing down would essentially be a slap in the face for everyone who died at Gettysburg, and this is that, right, all men are created equal, and that they are ruled by a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and that government shall not perish from the earth. He also kind of states that we are one nation, not a collection of sovereign states, right? This one perpetual union, which is why he's fighting. Whereas the Southerners had believed that the states had freely joined the Union and they could freely leave, and that's why they seceded when he became president. So, the other leader that we talked about was Ulysses S. Grant, right? And it's really hard to ignore Grant because Grant is going to, be a pretty hardcore general here when he takes over for the Union. And he's also going to end up being president, right? And he's going to get this nickname, the Butcher, for his willingness to use these superior Union numbers to his advantage. And while that might lead to many casualties, it's effectively a great strategy when you outnumber the Confederate soldiers almost 2-1, right? So his winning, right, favor Abraham Lincoln, or Abraham Lincoln favors his tactics here. And he's going to, once Ulysses S. Grant takes what's called Vicksburg in the West, and after his successful Western campaign, and this 1-2 punch basically in Gettysburg on July 3rd and Vicksburg on July 4th, you're going to get, this is the major turning point of the war, right? If Gettysburg is essentially considered the turning point, but Vicksburg is it comes up right afterwards, right? And this 1-2 punch really does a big deal, right? It's going to cut the Mississippi River, right? It's going to complete control of it for the Union, which is a big deal. It's going to cut off the rest of the Confederacy in the West from the ones in the East, and it's also going to cut off trade routes and things like that, right? So we talked about Sherman's march to the sea, with the war now being in Grant's hands in the East after Gettysburg and after his success at Vicksburg. Lincoln's going to promote him, and a man named William Tecumseh Sherman will take over the West, and he's going to lead an assault eventually into Atlanta, Georgia, and he's going to lay siege to Atlanta, and eventually win there. And in 1864 late, you're going to have, I can kind of point to it, right, this march to the sea, where it's going to be this kind of indiscriminate scorched earth policy, cutting a swath of destruction across Georgia here, living off the land, burning plantations, taking food and things like that from all these people in plantations, taking the railroads and heating them up and wrapping them around telegraph poles, and Sherman's bow ties, they become called, and Sherman's sentinels, which are all the burned out buildings of just the chimneys standing, right? It's a really harsh thing that Sherman and his men do here, because Sherman kind of has this belief that making war as terrible as possible is going to make it the suffering end more quickly here. That's kind of one of his beliefs about war here. So anyway, you have him eventually make it to Savannah, Georgia, and then start heading north to link up with General Grant, who is fighting kind of around Richmond, right? So anyway, you're just generally speaking, right, you're going to have these common soldiers. We know about them from things like letters we listened to and watched one of Ken Burns talking about this. We watched, we read a couple of these and listened to them anyway. So wounded soldiers often have permanent disabilities. They returned home in the South in many places to find homes destroyed and in poverty. Women in the front, right, often acted as nurses, but they in some cases even fought, right? Some managed the home. Families with scarce resources and assumed roles in taking over the farms and nursing and war industries, right? So there's some pictures here that kind of show a bunch of this, right? So you also have this surrender now at Appomattox. Richmond is going to fall in early 1865 here, and the dominoes are just going to continue, right? The Confederate government and Jefferson Davis are going to have fled the capital, and Robert E. Lee is going to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant roughly 1 week after the fall of Richmond in April 9th, 1865. They're going to be surrendering at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. They're going to in the parlor room of a man named Wilmer McLean. Again, you're not going to need to know that, but just a fun little anecdote is that the war at First Manassas here effectively starts in Wilmer McLean's backyard, and he moves to get away from the war and goes to a small sleepy town named Appomattox, and sure enough, the war is going to end in his parlor room. Just a kind of a fun little fact. But anyway, so Robert E. Lee does kind of urge Southerners to accept defeat and unite as Americans again, where some Southerners are going to want to fight on after Appomattox. And Robert E. Lee is going to continue on, and he is going to, Washington Lee University. He is going to kind of be the president of its Washington University at the time, I believe. So that's something that's important too that I guess I didn't actually put as a bullet point here. But anyway, so now the war is effectively over, and Lincoln is going to deliver his second inaugural address after he defeats McClellan, and this view that the United States is one indivisible nation is going to prevail, right? He believed that since secession was illegal, that the southern states were illegitimate, and they never really left the Union, and therefore were going to need to be brought back fairly swiftly and fairly easily, right? He believed that Reconstruction was just a matter of quickly restoring the legitimate southern state governments that had been, that these governments should now then be loyal to the Union. He also believed that we shouldn't punish them, right? He believed in not being punitive here because he felt that would just breed more animosity, right? This is actually a picture of him delivering his inaugural address. You can see him right there in the middle of the frame, real small there. And this is him after the fact, right? So just for fun, let's look at Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of the war, or beginning of his term. Look at that young, strapping man. And then as you get over here, the war has very obviously taken a toll on him, right? I would not want him to be president during the time. But anyway, we also know now that Abraham Lincoln is going to be assassinated just a few days later by a man named John Wilkes Booth, right? And just this assassination is going to enable the radical Republicans in Congress who did want to punish the South and be punitive measures toward the former Confederate States. It allowed them to be able to do that, right? Because they had what effectively comes down to a supermajority in Congress, and that's going to be one of the big parts of the Reconstruction era, right? The South is going to be put under military occupation because of the radical Republicans, right? So we talked about the economic impact of the war, right? We know that many southern states are going to suffer some major devastation, and they're going to be embittered and devastated by this war, right? Farms, railroads, factories have been destroyed in the South. Confederate money is going to be useless. Why would the Union take any of that, right? Many towns and cities, such as Richmond and Atlanta, lay burned and in ruins. The source of labor that many of these people had with the slaves is going to completely be gone and change due to the loss of life, but also the end of slavery, right? And the South is going to effectively remain an agriculturally based economy. while the rest of the country moves into the Industrial Revolution, right? And you're going to have some of the poorer sections of the nation being in the South for decades afterwards, right? Whereas the North's going to emerge as this industrial powerhouse. You're going to get the railroads, you're going to get the finishing of the transcontinental railroad, right? And this major industrialization in the North after we move away from wartime production. Anyway, okay? So, whew, all right, that was a mouthful. We got just a little bit more here to get through Reconstruction, and we'll be done for the evening. So remember, you can do your note card for me for tomorrow, so that note card will help you with this test. Okay? So, yeah, I'm not having an easy time talking. Let me take some water here, sorry. Okay. So in addition to the punitive action against the South, these radical Republicans, led by a man named Thaddeus Stevens, who is this dude right here, they also look to aggressively guarantee voting and other civil rights for African Americans, right? That's really nice of them. They truly believe in the civil rights of the freed slaves, which is pretty incredible if you think about the time period on some level, and knowing what the country's going to experience to effectively get those civil rights roughly 100 years later, right? And these radical Republicans are going to clash repeatedly with Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's successor. We talked about Andrew Johnson, who was being an opposite party of Abraham Lincoln. He was kind of made the vice president to kind of help bind up the nation's wounds, right, after the war. But so when he dies, it's going to turn over the presidency to the opposite party, which is like Donald Trump having chosen Hillary Clinton as a vice president. And if something happened to Donald Trump, then Hillary Clinton becoming president, that'd be a very, very strange circumstances, right? So anyway, his clashes with the radical Republicans ultimately lead to them trying to impeach him, and they get really close. They actually only fail by one vote from removing him from office. But anyway, right? So we talked about the Reconstruction Amendments, Richard, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and if you can remember this little mnemonic here, free citizens vote, you can remember what these amendments do, right? The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery permanently in the United States, right? Okay, that's a pretty big deal. It's a really hard amendment to get actually passed for the Constitution. If you have any interest in that at all, I would suggest watching the movie Lincoln. It's incredibly good, and it documents that process quite a bit and shows how hard of a fight it actually was. So next you get the 14th Amendment, right? States are prohibited from denying equal rights under the law to any Americans, right? This is to combat things like the black codes in the South and the southern states who are starting to get new legislatures imposing laws against the freed slaves, right? Trying to limit their accessibility to government and society and things like that. So you're also going to get the 15th Amendment, which is voting rights were guaranteed regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, right? But we know that the South is going to kind of ignore that stuff going forward a bit. We talked about sharecropping, right, which is the most common form of work for freed individuals, and it's often so not so dissimilar to slavery itself, right? They enter contracts in for rented plots of land and shared percentage of profits with the landowners and rented tools and things like that, and when it was all said and done, they really had almost nothing left, right? So if you're working the land and this landowner is making the profits and you're not making much at all, if anything, how different is that from slavery, right? But that's kind of all these people were able to do. Was their skill set. They were essentially wartime refugees and had no places to go at the end of the war, and that's the sad circumstance of where many of these people ended up, right? We talked about the Freedmen's Bureau, which is this government agency to formally, help these formerly enslaved people, right? They often distributed food, clothing, medical services. They helped establish schools to try to educate these people because education is super important for your status in life, right? They helped the freedmen acquire land and settle disputes with southern white farmers and things like that, and other free men if necessary, right? So I like this cartoon we looked at where you have this mob kind of looking to come after these freedmen. You have the blue-suited military official of the Freedmen's Bureau here kind of trying to prevent them from stopping them from going after them, right? So we also talked about the pushback of the South, right? When it comes down to it, the South was not happy with the Reconstruction. They were not happy with the occupation. And when it comes down to it, the Republicans, right, they were counting on the vote of the African Americans, right, that they were going to be able to stay in power because the African Americans, the freed men, were going to essentially what I like to say is stick to the end with the party that freed them, right? So the Republicans freed them. They're going to be voting for them in most cases, especially in national elections, right? So the South, some people in the South, some factions, some group of people that are still frustrated and bitter and angry about the end of the Civil War, and the freedmen's participation in politics and things like that, are going to start pushing back. And one of the ways they're going to start pushing back is the creation of organizations like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, right? And they look to thwart the African American efforts to vote, right, through intimidation and violence and things like that, and hoping to preserve this former way of life that they've known for so long. So yeah, and that is going to be fairly effective, right? So you also have now Reconstruction kind of coming to an end a little while, well, really 10 plus years later here. This violence, this tension, all of the above is going to go on for a real long time here. Just to keep it really simple here. And you're going to have people getting tired of it. And particularly the people in the North who are supporting it, the ones that they've sent the military and the military officials that are there, they're just be tired of it. They're tired of the resolve of the South to be discriminatory and to do all of these horrible things to these freedmen. And the bitterness of the post-war, right? And they're going to tire of it, and when in the election of 1876 is actually super close, and there are the votes disputed that are going to decide the election, the South makes a compromise with the Republicans, right? And they basically say, look, we'll give you the presidency, right, if you end the military occupation of the South, and you basically leave us be. And this compromise of 1877 is going to enable these former Confederates who controlled the Democratic Party to kind of regain power again, right? They're going to start to control the state legislatures. They're going to start to be back in Congress and the Senate, and the Republican majorities that we had seen that were pushing civil rights for the freedmen and things like that are going to start to disappear. And this is going to, with stepping away and ending the military occupation and stepping away from the South and Reconstruction, it's going to open the door for what becomes known as the Jim Crow era, right? Where African Americans in the South are going to be denied the full rights of American citizenship, even though these things were now enshrined in the Constitution, right? So Jim Crow laws is essentially what is known as lawful segregation, right? These laws that required African Americans and whites to be separated in public settings, right? You also had voting restrictions pushed by the Southerners against them to prevent them from voting, right? By voting, they worried these people in the South, right? It worried them because in some states like South Carolina, where the slaves had actually outnumbered the white people, when those people are now suddenly able to vote, they can vote how they want, and they can vote, give themselves rights, and that's crazy in general for these people in the South still after the animosity of the Civil War. So they do everything in their power to prevent this, right? And they do this through things like poll taxes, by forcing people to pay money to vote, right? And if you're poor and you can't afford much to even support your family, odds are you're not going to vote if it means you're going to either feed your family that night or vote. You have literacy tests, which we took in class, right, which were largely unfair, meant to be nearly impossible, and in fact, no one really passed these because of the ridiculousness of them. And the thing is, it was largely unfair because when it comes down to it, most of the people wouldn't have been able to pass it anyway, but you had what was known as grandfather clauses, which essentially exempted any of these white people that wouldn't have been able to pass these things by saying that since they had grandfathers who could vote, they can vote too. But of course, none of the freed men had grandparents that could vote because, well, they just were given that right? So they it's just one of these ways that was unfair that they got around things. And now with the North pulling out of the South after the compromise, they get away with skirting around the Constitution essentially, right? So you are going to have this push in the South, what's called the New South, for modernization, basically after the Reconstruction era, to kind of bring in factories and industrial work in the South. You're going to get this rise, a little bit of Southern industrial railroad and coal, iron, tobacco, cotton, lumber, and things like that, right? So I like to wrap this up, even though this is kind of a good deal after the Reconstruction era, by talking about a Supreme Court that kind of is kind of the, I guess, exclamation point for the Southerners here, that still did not wish to give equal rights to the freed slaves, right? So the Supreme Court's case, which is one of the most important Supreme Court cases and one of the most famous Supreme Court cases probably of all time, is ruled in 1896, and it essentially says that separation is okay. This whole Jim Crow laws are okay as long as African Americans have public access to public facilities or accommodation which are equal to those of whites, and this whole idea of separate but equal is legalized for more than 50 years until the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s. And you're going to have situations, right, where you have these train cars kind of like this, where this car, they might both get you to the same place. So to them, they're separate, but they're equal because they're going to get to the same place, even though they're absolutely not even close, right? So this goes all over the place. You're going to have waiting rooms for colored people, you know, and situations like that, as you can see, you know, by the picture down here. It's just this terrible time period in the South, that's going to, again, go on for a number of years here. So that is kind of everything that we talked about in a real rapid, fast nutshell. I hope that really helped you. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to get them out now. Otherwise, I'm going to be calling it a night, and leave you guys to your studying. Please, again, do not forget your note card, because I'm allowing you to kind of write whatever you want on there. It'd be really silly if you don't take advantage of that. It'd just be a wasted opportunity, and you should be able to do fairly well with a note card. So any last questions? If not, I am calling it a night, and I will see you guys all tomorrow.